Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. In the winter of 1873, the small German immigrant community of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, found itself caught in a web of whispers and fearful glances. At the center of this strange story was an 11-year-old girl named Emma Richtor, whose abilities were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. This pale, quiet child, seemingly so ordinary at first glance, possessed an extraordinary gift, one that would soon send the entire community into a spiral of fear. Emma could do things no one could explain. She could calculate the day of the week for any date in history, recite entire conversations word for word after hearing them just once, and even track the precise number of steps it took to walk between any two buildings in her neighborhood. At first, her abilities were seen as remarkable, perhaps even divine. But that quickly changed. When Emma began to use her gifts to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recount intimate details of crimes that no one believed she could have witnessed, the community's awe turned to dread. Whispers spread, and people began to question if Emma's powers were a blessing or something far darker. 3 men would soon be dead. A family would flee under cover of night, and Emma herself would vanish without a trace, leaving only a cryptic leather journal behind. But before we uncover the chilling truth behind Emma Richtor's mysterious mind, make sure you're subscribed, and let's step into this eerie chapter together. In the winter of 1873, the German immigrant community of Milwaukee was a small, tight-knit group, living on the edge of the bustling city. The harsh cold had taken hold, freezing Lake Michigan solid and casting a biting chill over the streets. Yet, the people of Brewery Town, as it was known, endured, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. Among the many families that made up this community, the Richter family stood out, not because they were wealthier or more influential, but because of their daughter, Emma, who would soon become the talk of the town. A quiet, reserved girl, Emma had always been different. Born on the harsh Atlantic crossing to America, she had arrived prematurely, a frail child, barely surviving the journey. From the very beginning, something about her seemed off. Her eyes, enormous and gray, took in everything with an unsettling intensity. As a child, she rarely cried, never demanding attention like other toddlers. Instead, she would sit silently in corners, watching and listening, observing the adult world around her with sharp focus. Emma's parents, Heinrich and Greta Richter, had come to America from Bavaria with hopes of building a new life. Heinrich worked as a brewmaster at the Kellner Brewery, one of the many beer factories that dotted the Milwaukee landscape, and Greta supported the family by doing laundry and mending. Despite their modest means, they were proud of their little family and their simple life in the bustling German quarter. However, as Emma grew, something remarkable or unsettling began to emerge. By the time she was 4, Emma could recite entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, mimicking the exact accents and inflections of the speakers. At first, her parents marveled at her memory, assuming it was simply an odd but harmless talent. But it didn't stop there. Emma's fascination with numbers and patterns grew more intense with every passing year. She could count everything: the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the exact number of steps it took to get from their front door to the bakery down the street, the precise time between the brewery whistles. It was when Heinrich, noticing her mathematical abilities, decided to teach her basic arithmetic that the true extent of Emma's gift became evident. She absorbed the concepts with terrifying speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could solve them on paper. Emma's mind seemed to work like a machine, calculating and memorizing with unnerving precision. The people in their neighborhood had begun to take notice as well. Some were intrigued, even impressed by the girl's strange abilities, while others were uneasy, unsure of what to make of her. Old Mrs. Brennan, an elderly woman who claimed to remember the witch trials in her grandmother's stories, was particularly nervous. She would cross herself whenever Emma's calculating eyes fell on her, as if fearing some kind of supernatural judgment. But Father Koller, the stout Bavarian priest who served the local parish, saw Emma's gifts in a different light. He declared her abilities to be a divine blessing, a sign that she had been chosen by God to demonstrate wisdom far beyond her years. In the cold, quiet streets of Milwaukee's German Quarter, the little girl who could solve mathematical equations faster than most adults became something of a curiosity, a phenomenon that both fascinated and unnerved those around her. As the years passed, Emma's abilities only grew more pronounced. The community began to whisper about the girl who could calculate the future, who seemed to know things that no one had told her. But it wasn't until the winter of 1872, when the weather became particularly harsh, that things began to take a darker turn. Milwaukee was enduring its coldest winter in years, with temperatures so low that Lake Michigan had frozen solid for the first time in a generation. The brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible indoors as they tried to stay warm, while their wives struggled to keep their families fed. It was during this isolated winter that Emma's abilities began to take on a more sinister tone. As the days grew colder and the nights grew longer, Emma spent hours sitting by the kitchen window, staring out at the snowy streets, her gray eyes watching the world with the same intense focus she applied to her mathematical problems. It was during these long, quiet days that Emma began to notice patterns not just in numbers, but in human behavior. She observed how people walked the same routes each day, how the order of events unfolded with an almost mechanical precision. Mr. Kruger, for instance, always took exactly 247 steps to get to the brewery, except on Wednesdays, when he would take a different path, requiring 284 steps. Mrs. Fisher always hung her laundry in the same order, but when her husband worked late, she changed the sequence entirely. These observations might have been dismissed as quirky habits of an unusually observant child, except that Emma began to vocalize these findings, sharing them with her parents in a way that was both unsettling and precise. Her first prediction came on a bleak February morning in 1873. Sitting at the kitchen table, Emma suddenly announced to her mother, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock. Greta, who had been preparing breakfast, nearly dropped the tin pail she was holding. The words were chilling, even to her. Why would Emma speak of such things? But Emma was calm, her eyes never leaving her mother's face as she explained in a matter-of-fact voice. He has been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday he drank 3 times more than usual. His steps were uneven. 251 instead of his normal 244. When people change their patterns by more than 10%, something significant happens within 72 hours. The prediction seemed absurd. How could a child, barely 11, know such details about Mr. Dietrich's life? But when the time came, Emma's words proved true. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 o'clock, Mr. Dietrich collapsed in the brewery's malt room, the official cause of death determined to be heart failure caused by chronic alcohol poisoning. The news of Emma's chilling accuracy spread quickly through the German Quarter. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others were less certain. The pale girl with the calculating eyes had made a prediction, and it had come true, down to the minute. The community was no longer simply curious about Emma's abilities. They were becoming fearful, and in the weeks that followed, that fear would only grow. The year was 1873, and Milwaukee was a city of contradictions. The industrial boom was in full swing, but the city's heart still beat to the rhythms of an older world, the world of small-town life and immigrant communities. Milwaukee's German Quarter was a microcosm of this duality, a place where old European customs fused with the promise of a new American life. It was here that the Richter family had built their home, nestled among the breweries and bakeries, the clinking of bottles and the smell of fresh bread mingling in the air. At the time, Milwaukee was growing rapidly, its population swelled by immigrants from Germany who had fled the hardships of the old country in search of a better life in America. The city's economy was fueled by its breweries, Schlitz, Best, and a dozen smaller operations that provided the city with its famous beer. It was a community that relied on each other. Men worked side by side in the breweries, while their wives took care of the homes and gardens, growing vegetables and herbs from the old country, their lives a constant dance of work, church, and family. The German Quarter was a blend of rustic simplicity and industrious energy. The streets were narrow and crowded, lined with red brick houses and small wooden cottages. The sound of children playing and adults speaking in a mix of German and English filled the air. The scent of roasting meats and baking bread wafted from the bakeries, while the sharp tang of hops and yeast was ever present from the nearby breweries. The Richter family was part of this vibrant community. Heinrich Richter, the father, worked as a brewmaster at the Kellner Brewery, one of the mid-sized breweries that helped quench Milwaukee's growing thirst. He was a quiet, hard-working man, well-liked among his colleagues, known for his meticulous attention to detail and dedication to the craft of brewing. His wife, Greta, was a seamstress, known for her nimble fingers that could stitch clothes and repair linens with incredible speed. Their life was simple but comfortable, a far cry from the hardships they had left behind in Bavaria. They had come to America in search of prosperity, and it seemed as though they had found it. But amid all the hard work and simple pleasures of their life, there was one thing that set the Richter family apart from their neighbors: their daughter, Emma. Emma's presence was hard to ignore. Though she was quiet, even reserved, there was something about her that seemed to draw attention. Her strikingly large gray eyes, which seemed to see everything, gave her an intensity that was unsettling to those who came into contact with her. Emma was the kind of child who stood still for hours, observing the world around her with a laser focus. And it was during these long hours of silent watching that Emma's extraordinary abilities began to manifest. Her early talents, an almost photographic memory, the ability to calculate and memorize with astonishing precision, seemed like harmless quirks at first. Neighbors marveled at how Emma could recall the smallest details from conversations she had overheard days before, or how she could calculate the day of the week for any date in history without ever looking it up. It was as if she was able to retain every piece of information she encountered, every moment she experienced, and catalog it in a mental library that was as vast as it was precise. But Emma's talents were not limited to memory and mathematics. It became clear that she had an uncanny ability to track patterns in human behavior. She could tell when someone's routine had shifted, even if that shift was as small as a few steps in a different direction. She noticed things that others missed, details that most people would never have thought to observe. In the world of busy brewery workers and bustling street markets, Emma saw a hidden order that others couldn't. In the early days, Emma's parents had been proud of her abilities. Heinrich and Greta could not understand the full extent of her gifts, but they recognized that their daughter was unique. They were happy for her to share her talents with the community, proud to have a child who could solve complex mathematical problems with ease. But the more Emma's abilities grew, the more her presence began to unsettle those around her. The neighbors in the German quarter had been supportive at first, but as Emma grew older, some began to view her with suspicion. Old Mrs. Brennan, a superstitious woman with a long memory of old-world tales, was particularly uneasy. She believed that Emma's abilities might not be a gift from God, but something darker. In the tight-knit world of the German quarter, there was no place for outsiders, and Emma was beginning to feel like one, despite being born into the very heart of the community. Even Father Koller, the priest who had once called Emma's talents a divine blessing, began to question her gifts. He had originally seen her abilities as a sign that God had chosen her for something special. But the more Emma predicted deadly accidents, secrets no one else could know, the more uneasy the priest became. There were whispers in the church, among the old men who met in the pews after Mass, about whether such extraordinary gifts were truly divine or something far more sinister. The tension in the German quarter was palpable. People began to avoid the Richter family, not because they disliked them, but because Emma had become a figure of fear. Her predictions, though often accurate, were increasingly dark, and the more she saw, the less she seemed to care about the consequences of revealing the truths she uncovered. By early 1873, the strange girl who had once been the pride of the German quarter had become a source of unease and suspicion. People whispered about her abilities in the alleys and behind closed doors. They wondered if she was simply a genius, or if she was something darker, perhaps even a witch. Whatever they believed, one thing was certain: Emma was no longer just a child. She was something much more, and the people around her would soon find out just how dangerous it could be to live in the shadow of her extraordinary mind. As winter deepened in 1873, the Richter family's life began to shift in ways they couldn't have anticipated. It wasn't just the bitter cold that made the air heavy. It was the growing tension that surrounded their daughter, Emma. The community had already started whispering about the girl who could predict things that no one could explain, and with each passing day, Emma's abilities seemed to grow stronger, more pronounced, and more unsettling. Emma was still a young girl, barely 11, but her mind operated at a level far beyond her years. It wasn't just that she had an exceptional memory or a natural talent for arithmetic, though both of those were remarkable enough. It was the way she saw the world around her. Emma saw patterns where others saw chaos. While the adults around her struggled to make sense of the daily grind, Emma could instantly calculate the number of steps someone took between two buildings or predict the time it would take a particular cart to reach the market. Her observations were exact and precise, often bordering on the uncanny. Her early abilities were harmless enough. When her father, Heinrich, taught her basic arithmetic, Emma absorbed the concepts with astonishing speed. She solved problems in her head faster than he could jot them down on paper. It became clear to him that Emma's mind was different. She could grasp complex mathematical concepts with ease, but it didn't stop there. Emma's understanding of numbers went beyond simple equations. She began to notice patterns in everything, from the way people spoke to the way they moved, and it became almost as if the world around her had a rhythm that only she could perceive. At first, Heinrich thought it was a gift. His pride in his daughter's intelligence was evident whenever he spoke to his friends at the brewery or their neighbors on Galena Street. But as the days passed, Emma's observations became more intricate, and it was clear that her abilities were not limited to simple calculations. The child who had once amazed her parents with her ability to memorize entire conversations now began to observe things that no one else could see. One day, as she sat in the kitchen, eating her breakfast, Emma casually mentioned, "Mr. Kruger takes exactly 247 steps to the brewery each day." Greta, who was preparing lunch for Heinrich, froze for a moment. "How do you know that, Emma?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Emma replied matter-of-factly, "I've counted them, Mama. I watch the way he walks. His pattern is always the same." Greta, still not fully understanding the depth of her daughter's abilities, smiled softly, thinking it was just another of Emma's peculiarities. But over the next few days, Emma's remarks grew more pointed and less innocent. She began to note the exact number of steps her neighbors took on their way to the bakery, or the specific time it took for certain events to unfold, like the delivery of coal from the local yard, or how long it took the baker's oven to warm up. She could recount the exact sequence of actions people took, as if she had an invisible clock running in her head, keeping track of everything. At first, it was a novelty. Emma's parents were amazed at her ability to remember such minute details, but they began to notice something strange. The more Emma observed, the more she withdrew from the world around her. She no longer played with the other children on the street, nor did she engage in the usual games or chatter that filled the air during the day. Instead, she would sit quietly at the window of their small home, her gaze fixed on the movement outside. Her parents thought it was just the isolation of winter. After all, it was colder than usual, and the snow seemed to bury the world in a silence that made it hard for anyone to escape the cold. But it was something more than that. Emma's thoughts were no longer just mathematical. They were becoming observational, focused on the people in her community and their behavior. One afternoon, as the wind howled outside and the snow drifted lazily past their small house, Emma turned to her father and said, "Mr. Dietrich will die at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He has been drinking more than usual. His steps have changed. I can feel it." Heinrich looked up, startled, unsure of how to respond. He had always known his daughter was different, but this prediction was so specific, so certain, that it sent a shiver down his spine. Emma's calm certainty was unnerving. She wasn't saying these things in an anxious, excited way. She said them as if they were facts, mathematical truths that couldn't be argued with. And that was the moment Heinrich started to feel the weight of her abilities, the eerie sense that she wasn't just a child with an unusual memory. There was something deeper, something darker, behind her observations. He couldn't dismiss them as childish imagination anymore. As the day wore on, the strange prediction seemed less like a passing comment and more like an inevitable conclusion. At exactly 2 p.m., word spread through the German quarter that Mr. Dietrich had collapsed in the brewery, his body found cold and lifeless, a victim of the very alcohol poisoning that Emma had described. The cause of death was officially ruled as heart failure, but the timing was what unsettled the community. Emma had predicted his death to the very minute. The news spread like wildfire through Milwaukee's German quarter, and the reactions were mixed. Some people dismissed it as a coincidence, something that could be easily explained away. But others were less certain. They couldn't ignore the accuracy of Emma's prediction, nor could they deny that the young girl had known something no one else had. The whispers began again, but this time, they weren't filled with awe or admiration. They were filled with fear. People started asking, how could she know this? What else might she see? Emma's abilities, once seen as a harmless oddity, were now a source of tension and fear. Her ability to calculate, memorize, and predict had crossed a line. It wasn't just a talent. It was a gift that made people question the very nature of reality. Was Emma the product of divine intervention, or was there something much darker at play in her extraordinary mind? As Emma's abilities became more widely known in the German quarter, the whispers grew louder. At first, they were only murmurs, curious neighbors wondering how such a young child could possess such an unsettling talent. But as the days passed and more of Emma's predictions came true, the curiosity turned to unease. It was no longer just her calculating nature that caught attention, but the accuracy of her unsettling predictions and the dark secrets she seemed to uncover. The town that had once embraced the Richter family now began to fear them. Emma's parents had always been proud of her. Heinrich was proud of his daughter's intelligence, believing her mathematical prowess to be a gift from God. Greta was no different. She saw Emma's memory and intellect as the natural result of a hard-working upbringing, the product of their family's humble roots. But neither of them had expected the wave of dread that followed Emma's increasing precognition. Neighbors began to avoid the Richter house, and the normal chatter of the street grew quieter when the family passed by. The children who had once played in the streets with Emma began to stay away, casting sidelong glances at the girl who seemed to know too much. It was no longer just a matter of Emma's ability to recite facts or solve problems with astounding speed. It was her predictions that unnerved them. When Mrs. Weber began to spend increasing amounts of time with Ernst Kellner, the owner of the brewery where Heinrich worked, Emma was the first to notice. One morning, as she casually buttered her bread, she remarked to her mother, "Mrs. Weber has been meeting with Mr. Kellner every Tuesday afternoon. She says she's going to her sister's house, but she's walking the wrong way. She's going to the brewery." Greta, who had been listening to the news with a sense of unease, glanced at her daughter and asked, "How do you know this, Emma?" Emma, as usual, was calm in her reply. "I watch. I count. I remember." Her explanation was simple and mechanical, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. At first, no one took Emma's comments seriously. After all, Mrs. Weber was an upstanding woman, and Ernst Kellner was a respected member of the community. But as the weeks went by, Emma's observations grew more disturbing. She didn't just notice patterns in people's movements. She began to notice changes in behavior. She could tell when someone was hiding something, when someone was lying, and when their actions didn't align with their words. The more she observed, the more she began to uncover. Heinrich was the first to realize how deeply Emma's ability had affected their family. He had always prided himself on his work at the brewery, his skill as a brewmaster respected by those around him. But as Emma's predictions grew more specific and accurate, his colleagues began to look at him with suspicion. It was no longer just the occasional strange look from Mrs. Brennan, the elderly neighbor who crossed herself whenever Emma passed by. Now, the workers at the brewery were avoiding him, keeping their distance. Ernst Kellner, once a friendly face at company gatherings, had begun to ignore Heinrich entirely, and the whispers about Emma's abilities were reaching the ears of those who were once Emma's biggest supporters. The turning point came one cold evening when Father Koller, the priest who had once praised Emma as a divine prodigy, called Hinrich aside after Mass. The priest's jovial demeanor had been replaced by a somber expression, his tone less certain than before. "Hinrich, my friend," he began. "Perhaps it would be best if young Emma spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers. The Lord gives us gifts, yes, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." The words hit Hinrich like a blow. He had always trusted Father Koller, but now there was doubt in the priest's voice, a doubt that made him question not only his daughter's abilities but the very nature of her gifts. Could Emma's extraordinary talent really be a blessing from God? Or was there something darker at play? Had the community been right to fear her? As the weeks went by, Emma's predictions became even more specific and unsettling. She spoke with eerie calmness about the lives of their neighbors, predicting personal tragedies, family secrets, and even deaths. When she casually remarked one morning, "Mr. Weber will come home to find his wife with Mr. Kellner tomorrow at noon. There will be violence." Greta felt her stomach churn with dread. Sure enough, the next day, Mr. Weber returned home from his deliveries to find his wife, Anna, in a compromising position with Ernst Kellner in the brewery office. The confrontation that followed left Kellner with a broken nose and Mr. Weber bruised, while Anna was beaten so badly that a doctor had to be called. The scandal rocked the tight-knit German community. But what unsettled everyone even more was the growing realization that Emma had predicted the entire sequence of events. The precision of her predictions, the exact timing of the incident, the details of the confrontation, was too exact to dismiss as coincidence. The Richter family became increasingly isolated. Former friends began avoiding them at church, and the children who had once played with Emma on the streets were now forbidden from doing so. The brewery workers who had once shared beer and laughter with Hinrich now avoided him, muttering behind his back about the strange girl with the calculating gray eyes. But Emma herself seemed oblivious to the growing tension. She continued her daily observations, her mind always calculating, always watching, never resting. To her, the world was a complex series of numbers and patterns, and nothing more. As the days passed, the tension in the German quarter of Milwaukee only intensified. The whispers about Emma grew more frequent, and the once proud community of immigrants that had built their lives in the city's industrial heart now found themselves divided. They had witnessed Emma's extraordinary abilities and, as time went on, many began to fear her. No longer just for her mathematical genius, but for the uncanny way she predicted the future, often with chilling accuracy. But nothing would prepare the people of Milwaukee's German quarter for Emma's next prediction. A prediction that would leave the entire community reeling and wondering just how much she knew. It all started on a bleak, cold afternoon in late February of 1873. The wind had picked up, swirling the snow in vicious spirals, and the streets of the German quarter were covered in a thick blanket of white. It was a day like any other, with the brewery workers heading to their shifts and the women preparing for the day's tasks. But as the clock ticked on, Emma sat quietly at the kitchen table, her usual position by the window, her sharp gray eyes scanning the streets outside with an intensity that had become all too familiar. Greta, her mother, was busy in the kitchen, preparing lunch for Hinrich when Emma, without looking up from her spot at the window, calmly said, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock. Greta froze, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the bowl she was holding down on the table. She turned to Emma, her face pale, her voice faltering. "Emma, what are you saying? Why would you think such a thing?" But Emma remained calm, her expression almost serene, as if the words she had spoken were nothing more than a simple fact. She continued, "He's been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days now. Yesterday he drank more than usual. His steps were uneven, 251 instead of his usual 244. People who change their patterns by more than 10% usually experience something significant within 72 hours. Mr. Dietrich's pattern has changed by 12%. He will die today." Greta's stomach twisted with unease. She knew her daughter was different, but this was too much. To predict something so specific, so grim, was beyond anything she had ever heard. "Emma, you mustn't say such things." Greta's voice was filled with panic now, her maternal instinct taking over. She had heard rumors of her daughter's unusual talents, but this felt unnatural. Emma simply nodded, as though she had just described the weather. "I've calculated it, Mama. It's simple math." As the afternoon wore on, Heinrich prepared to leave for the brewery. As usual, the sharp whistle of the brewery's signal horn blew at 2 p.m., marking the end of the workday. The community would gather for a meal, the men would unwind, and families would share stories. But this day, as the clock struck 2 p.m., something different happened. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 o'clock, the news came. Mr. Dietrich, a regular at the brewery, had collapsed in the malt room. He was dead. The official cause was heart failure, a result of chronic alcohol poisoning. But the details matched Emma's prediction with eerie precision. His uneven steps, his increasing alcohol consumption, and his general unwellness. All of it had been calculated by Emma long before it had come to pass. The news spread like wildfire. The community was shaken to its core. Some dismissed it as mere coincidence, but others couldn't ignore the chilling accuracy of Emma's words. She had predicted Mr. Dietrich's death to the exact minute. Her abilities were no longer just a curiosity, they were a matter of concern. The following days were filled with whispers, confusion, and fear. The community was divided. There were those who praised Emma, calling her predictions a sign of divine insight. But there were just as many who felt a creeping dread. How could a child know such things? What else did Emma know? And more importantly, what would she predict next? Heinrich and Greta tried to push the incident from their minds, but it lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over their home. Heinrich, in particular, was deeply troubled. He had always trusted his daughter, but this was too much. The idea that Emma could predict death with such certainty weighed heavily on him. He couldn't understand it. Was this really a gift? Or was there something more sinister at play here? Father Collar was the first to express his doubts openly. What had once been seen as a divine gift now seemed like something to fear. The community's reverence for Emma began to turn into suspicion. Her strange abilities were no longer seen as a blessing, but as something dangerous. The more Emma predicted, the more people began to question whether such knowledge should be feared. Some even began to speak in hushed tones about whether Emma's gift was a curse. Despite the growing fear, Emma remained unfazed. Her mind continued to function as it always had, calculating and observing. She was not distressed by the events she predicted. In fact, she seemed detached, as though she were simply performing an experiment, observing patterns, calculating outcomes, and seeing the future unfold with the precision of a mathematician. Heinrich and Greta, however, could no longer ignore the growing isolation that surrounded their family. People began to look at them differently, their once friendly smiles replaced by sideways glances. The Richter family had become pariahs, their daughter's strange gift turning them into something of a freak show. As the days passed, the weight of what Emma had predicted began to settle into the hearts of the community. Emma's uncanny ability to foresee events had marked her as someone to be feared, and the Richter family would soon learn just how much power such a mind could wield, and how dangerous that power could be. The chilling events following Emma's first prediction sent shockwaves through the German quarter of Milwaukee. As her abilities continued to manifest with unsettling accuracy, a quiet but palpable unease began to take hold of the community. The once close-knit neighborhood, where everyone knew everyone's business, was now full of suspicion, and the Richter family found themselves caught in the crossfire of growing fear and resentment. At first, Emma's predictions were treated with a mixture of awe and admiration, even though they were increasingly disturbing. After Mr. Dietrich's death, some in the community believed that Emma had been blessed with divine insight, a gift meant to warn them of danger. But as Emma's predictions continued, they began to feel more like ominous omens than blessings. It wasn't just the accuracy of her forecasts. It was the dark, sinister nature of the things she predicted. Death, betrayal, misfortune. Emma's parents, Heinrich and Greta, were caught in a whirlwind of confusion. Heinrich could not understand how his daughter's abilities could have such an impact. To him, she was still the same quiet, bright girl he had always known. But the community's growing hostility made it impossible to ignore the gravity of her gifts. He had once been proud of Emma, but now he found himself burdened with guilt and doubt. Greta was no different, though she tried to reassure herself that Emma's predictions were simply an extension of her remarkable intelligence. The toll it took on their family was undeniable. Their isolation became apparent when their once friendly neighbors started avoiding them. Children, who had once played with Emma on the streets, were now forbidden from visiting the Richter home. Even simple errands became difficult. Heinrich noticed that shopkeepers would serve him quickly and without conversation. Their eyes filled with discomfort whenever he came into view. The bustling, lively community they had once known felt distant, like something slipping away, and the Richter family was at the heart of the division. The tipping point came one cold, gray morning in March when Emma made another of her unnerving predictions. This time, she wasn't speaking of death, but of betrayal. She announced, in the same calm, almost detached manner she always used, that Mr. Weber would discover his wife, Anna, in a compromising position with Ernst Kellner, the wealthy owner of the Kellner brewery. There will be violence, Emma added, her gray eyes fixed on her mother, as if she were simply recounting a factual event. Greta felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. She had noticed the closeness between Anna Weber and Ernst Kellner in the past, but she had dismissed it as nothing more than harmless familiarity. Now, Emma's prediction gave it an entirely different weight. "Emma, you mustn't say such things," Greta whispered, her voice barely above a tremor. But Emma remained unmoved. "Mr. Weber will return early from his delivery route. He will find them together." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. "The violence will be quick. Mr. Kellner will suffer a broken nose, and Mr. Weber will harm his wife." The next day, exactly as Emma had predicted, Mr. Weber returned early from his deliveries to find Anna and Ernst Kellner in a compromising position behind the brewery. The confrontation that followed was violent, with Mr. Weber beating Kellner to a pulp before turning on his wife, leaving her bloodied and bruised. The scandal shook the community to its core. The timing of the prediction, the specificity of the details, and the violence that followed unnerved the already frightened residents. It wasn't just Emma's mind that was feared now. It was the terrible consequences of having her in their midst. The once innocent girl had become a harbinger of doom. She predicted betrayal, tragedy, and, most disturbingly, she seemed to have an uncanny ability to draw these tragic events out into the open. The more Emma's predictions came true, the more people began to believe she wasn't simply seeing the future. She was somehow causing it to happen. The community's isolation of the Richter family became almost complete. The tension between the Richters and the rest of the neighborhood was now undeniable. Former friends avoided them in church, and even Father Koller, who had once seen Emma's talents as a divine gift, began to distance himself. No longer was Emma seen as a prodigy, a child of divine favor. Instead, she was becoming a symbol of fear, a walking omen that cast a shadow over the entire community. The Richter family felt the weight of their isolation more with each passing day. Heinrich, always practical and grounded, began to wonder if it might be better to leave Milwaukee altogether. He had already seen the strain Emma's abilities had placed on his family, and now the growing animosity was becoming unbearable. Greta shared his concerns, but the thought of leaving the life they had worked so hard to build was heartbreaking. Yet, the more Emma predicted, the more it became clear that the family would never escape the darkness that had settled over them. There was no escaping the truth. Emma's abilities, once a source of pride, had become an inescapable burden, one that would eventually force them to make a choice: stay in a community that had grown to fear them or leave behind everything they had worked for. As the tension continued to build, Emma, oblivious to the growing animosity around her, continued with her silent observations. Her eyes, ever watchful, saw more than anyone else did. And in her mind, the predictions were as simple as the numbers she calculated. They were inevitable. By the time spring arrived in 1873, the atmosphere in Milwaukee's German quarter had grown tense, suffocating under the weight of Emma's predictions. The Richter family was now seen as outcasts, their once celebrated daughter the cause of their social ostracism. Every whispered conversation in the street, every sideways glance cast their way, felt like an accusation. But it wasn't just the personal tragedies and confrontations that made the community uncomfortable. It was the undeniable truth that Emma had uncovered something far darker than anyone had expected. Emma's ability to predict people's behaviors, their actions, and even their deepest secrets had moved beyond mere observations. She had begun to piece together a disturbing truth about the very community that had once embraced her family. The realization came slowly, like the tightening of a noose around the neck, until Emma could no longer ignore the truth that her mind had been calculating for weeks. It was early in April when Emma first mentioned something that made her parents' blood run cold. She had been keeping her journal, a leather-bound book filled with precise calculations, charts, and timelines that no one had dared to read. For weeks, Emma had been jotting down observations, quietly compiling data on everything and everyone. But one evening, she casually turned to her father, Heinrich, and said, "Papa, I need to show you something important." Heinrich, exhausted from his work at the brewery, looked up at his daughter with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What is it, Emma?" he asked, hoping she might have found a new equation to solve or a simple observation about the neighborhood. But the look in Emma's eyes was different. There was an intensity there, a certainty that made Heinrich's heart race. Emma flipped open her journal and pointed to a series of detailed charts and maps. "I've been observing the men in our community, Papa. The brewery workers. I've noticed something, a pattern." She traced her finger over a map of the German quarter, where she had carefully marked locations and times. Heinrich leaned forward, his heart sinking with each word that followed. "7 men, Papa. 7 men from our community have been meeting every Wednesday at midnight in the basement of Kellner Brewery." Emma's voice was calm, but her words hit like a thunderclap. Heinrich's breath caught in his chest. 7 men? Ernst Kellner, the brewery owner, and several men he knew well had been involved in clandestine meetings, unknown to the people of the quarter. It didn't make sense. Why would they meet in secret, and what were they planning? Emma continued, unaffected by her father's stunned silence. "I calculated their movements based on their routines. Mr. Steinberg always leaves his shop at the same time each Wednesday. I've observed him walking to the brewery, avoiding the main streets. The others follow the same route. There is no mistake." Heinrich's hands shook as he tried to process what Emma was saying. He knew Steinberg, a quiet man who had lived in the community for years, and Kellner, the man who had helped them when they first arrived in Milwaukee, a figure of authority in their tight-knit community. To think that these men, these trusted figures, were involved in something dark, something illegal, was beyond comprehension. Emma continued, pointing to the figures in her journal. "I also noticed discrepancies in the brewery's records. Beer production doesn't match the deliveries made to the local pubs. I calculated that there have been missing kegs, lots of missing kegs." The revelation hit Heinrich like a hammer. The brewery he had worked for, the brewery where he had poured so many hours into perfecting his craft, was part of a systematic theft ring. They were stealing from the brewery, lying to the public, and hiding their actions behind closed doors. Kellner, a man he had once respected, was orchestrating the whole thing. Emma turned the page in her journal, revealing the names of the 7 men involved. The loss totals are significant. Over $47,000 has been stolen over the last 2 years. And I believe Mr. Kellner is the one who's been organizing it all. Heinrich could hardly breathe as he looked at the names in Emma's journal, Kellner's, Steinberg's, and other familiar faces. The calculation was simple to Emma, a mathematical certainty, but to Heinrich it was a betrayal beyond words. He had worked for Kellner Brewery for years, trusting in the man's reputation, believing in the integrity of the work. Now, all that he had built his life upon seemed tainted with lies and corruption. The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on Heinrich's chest. The magnitude of Emma's discovery, the very fabric of their community, was unraveling before his eyes. And worse still, the danger Emma had uncovered was now coming straight for them. These men would do anything to protect their secrets, and Emma's mind had seen too much. As Emma finished her explanation, she looked up at her father with cold, calculating eyes. Papa, they will try to stop me. They know I see their patterns. They can't allow me to expose them. Heinrich's heart raced with a new sense of dread. Emma's mind had already calculated their next steps, but the danger was now closer than ever. The family was no longer just in danger of being ostracized. They were in real peril. The days following Emma's revelation were filled with a palpable sense of tension. The Richter family had always been a part of the German quarter, their lives intertwined with the community's routines and rhythms. But now, their existence felt fragile, their every movement scrutinized by eyes that were filled with fear and suspicion. The very fabric of their lives was unraveling. Emma's discovery of the brewing conspiracy had shaken the foundations of the community, and the more her predictions came true, the more the danger surrounding her grew. It wasn't just the threat of social rejection anymore. Emma's mind had uncovered a criminal ring, and the men behind it would do anything to protect their secrets. Despite the growing tension, Emma remained unshaken. She continued her observations, calmly noting patterns, calculating the future with her usual detachment. Heinrich and Greta had tried to shelter her from the growing animosity, but Emma was no longer the innocent, curious child she once was. The community's fear had transformed her into something darker, something the people now saw as a threat. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the narrow streets of the German quarter, Heinrich received a visit at the brewery. Ernst Kellner, the man who had once been a friend, now stood before him, his face unreadable. There was no warmth in his greeting, only coldness. He had heard the rumors, and he wasn't here to offer sympathy. He was here with a message. Heinrich, I think you understand the situation. Your daughter is no longer just an oddity. Kellner's voice was low, filled with a chilling authority. She's become a liability, and if you don't take care of it, we will. The threat was clear, even though it wasn't spoken outright. Kellner wasn't just worried about Emma. He was worried about his secrets being exposed. The men involved in the conspiracy had to protect their operation, and Emma's mind, sharp and calculating, had already pieced everything together. She knew the truth, and that truth Kellner believed had to be silenced. Heinrich's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls were closing in on him. He had always known that there was something dark beneath the surface of the community, but to hear it from Kellner's lips, to see the man who had once been a colleague threatening his family, it was more than he could bear. That night, as the shadows deepened, Emma's mind was working furiously, calculating the movements of the men she had so carefully observed. She had already seen their next move, the steps they would take to protect themselves. But it wasn't just the men of the brewery who would act. Emma's predictions had grown more specific, more precise, and now they weren't just about the future, they were about survival. As the clock struck midnight, Emma sat alone in her room, her leather journal spread out before her. The pages were filled with complex calculations, maps of the quarter, and symbols that only she could understand. But the most chilling of her entries was the one that would change everything. They are coming for us, Emma wrote in her journal, her small hand steady as she wrote the final lines. I've calculated it. The probability is 92%. They will make their move within the next 72 hours. If we don't leave, we will be in danger. Heinrich and Greta had already sensed the change in the air. The warning from Kellner had been clear. The community, once their home, had become a place of hostility and fear. It was no longer safe. The time had come for them to leave. But leaving wasn't as simple as packing a few belongings and walking away. The community knew too much about them now, and Emma's revelations had made them a target. They had no time to waste. The Richter family quickly packed their belongings, moving in silence under the cover of darkness. As the night crept on, the streets of Milwaukee's German quarter seemed eerily empty, the shadows playing tricks on their eyes. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, the faintest hint of movement, but Emma's predictions had already told her everything. They were safe for now. As the family disappeared into the night, leaving their lives behind in the only home they had ever known, Emma's mind raced ahead. She had already calculated the next steps in their journey. The future, as always, was a series of numbers, a pattern she could see clearer than anyone else. But as they left Milwaukee, one thing was certain. The Richter family would never escape the shadow of Emma's extraordinary mind. The danger was far from over. As the Richter family made their way through the quiet streets of Milwaukee in the dead of night, their hearts were heavy with a mixture of relief and dread. Emma's predictions had been eerily accurate, and the community's rejection had become unbearable. They knew their time in the German quarter was over. The realization settled heavily over them. They had no choice but to leave. Heinrich and Greta walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick snow. It was still early spring, but the chill in the air seemed to mirror the coldness that had crept into their once welcoming community. They had packed quickly, in the dead of night, trying to avoid notice. The Richter family had always been known for their quiet, hard-working nature, but now they were leaving without a trace, forced to abandon everything they had worked for. Emma, walking ahead of her parents, was disturbingly calm. Her large, gray eyes were focused ahead, as if the future had already been mapped out for her. She had calculated their escape, exactly how long it would take to pack, when they needed to leave, and the best route to avoid detection. Emma's mind, as always, was a machine, calculating the odds, timing every decision, predicting every possible outcome. For her, the escape wasn't a last-ditch effort to survive. It was simply another equation. Greta stole a glance at her daughter, the child who had once been the pride of their family, the one who could memorize conversations, solve complex arithmetic problems, and predict the timing of natural events, had grown into something else. Emma's detachment from human emotions, her analytical approach to life, had become a source of both awe and fear. It was her mind, after all, that had caused the community's rejection. They feared her because they didn't understand her, and that fear had become a tangible thing, shaping the fate of the Richter family. They reached the edge of the German quarter, and Heinrich glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the familiar faces of their neighbors. Father Koller, the women of the neighborhood, the brewery workers who had once greeted him with friendly smiles. But now, the streets were eerily silent, the houses darkened behind closed windows. No one was watching them, but the weight of their departure still felt heavy, as though the eyes of the entire community were on them, even in their absence. Emma spoke quietly, breaking the silence. "We should leave the city now, Papa. They'll come after us soon." Heinrich nodded grimly. He had always trusted Emma's calculations, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how precise her predictions had been. She hadn't just predicted the deaths and the scandals. She had predicted their escape, the exact moment they would have to leave, the path they would need to take, the likelihood of someone noticing them. It was all part of the plan, part of the inevitable sequence of events that Emma had foreseen. The family crossed into the next neighborhood, the familiar houses of the German quarter now far behind them. Heinrich felt a pang of regret. He had spent years building his life here, working at the brewery, making connections, raising his family. But it was all for nothing now. Their ties to the community were severed. It wasn't just that they had been ostracized. It was that Emma's mind, her gift, had put them in grave danger. She had uncovered things no one was meant to know, and the men behind those secrets would stop at nothing to keep them buried. They reached the outskirts of the city, and Emma led the way with surprising confidence. Greta glanced at her husband, her expression torn between relief and sorrow. They were finally leaving the danger behind, but what awaited them on the road ahead? Would they ever find a place where Emma could live without fear of what she might reveal? Where they could live without the shadows of suspicion that now followed them wherever they went? "We'll be safe now, Mama, Papa. I've calculated it." Emma's voice was steady, almost reassuring, though there was a chilling finality in her words. As they stepped into the wilderness beyond the city's limits, Heinrich and Greta realized that this wasn't just an escape. It was a new beginning. But the future was uncertain. They had left behind a life, a community, and everything they had ever known. And the Richter family had no idea where they would go from here or what awaited them. But for now, they were free from the fear and the danger that had plagued them in Milwaukee. But Emma, ever the observer, never stopped calculating. She had already begun to analyze the next stage of their journey, to see the paths before them laid out in numbers and probabilities. For Emma, the future was simply a series of equations waiting to be solved. And she would solve them all, no matter the cost. Months passed since the Richter family's escape from Milwaukee. The quiet towns of Minnesota offered them a semblance of peace, far from the whispers and fear that had driven them from their old life. Heinrich found work at a small brewery in New Ulm, a town far from the shadow of the German quarter. Greta slowly began to rebuild the routines of their home, sewing, cooking, and creating a semblance of normality. But Emma, ever the observer, never truly settled. She spent her days in solitude, poring over her journals, continuing her observations with a calm detachment that unsettled her parents. Emma's mind had always been a thing apart, mathematically precise, calculating, and cold. She never stopped analyzing. While her parents hoped that the fresh start would offer her a life of normalcy, Emma was already planning her next steps. The future, to her, was simply a series of probabilities, a puzzle to be solved, and there were no emotions or attachments in her mind, only numbers and patterns. Her parents couldn't understand the distance between them and their daughter. They had hoped the quiet of their new home would allow Emma to be free of the fear that had haunted her in Milwaukee. But the truth was, Emma's mind couldn't be contained. It had been shaped by years of predicting the future, by tracking human behavior with an intensity no child should possess. In New Ulm, she continued to record her observations. She created detailed charts, cataloging human behavior and predicting events. Emma's journal, once a collection of simple calculations, was now filled with complex matrices and probabilities. She had already begun tracking the movements of people in this new town, creating elaborate models of their actions, as if the world around her was just another set of numbers to be decoded. The Richter family had escaped the shadows of Milwaukee, but they couldn't escape the truth. Emma's mind had become both their salvation and their curse. They could run, but they could never truly leave the past behind. And as Emma's powers grew, the question lingered. Could they ever escape the burden of her extraordinary gifts? They had found peace, but it was a fragile one built on the quiet understanding that Emma's mind would never stop calculating, never stop watching, never stop seeing.